He told 175,000 employees their jobs were safe. Then he made the company pay him rent to exist. For most of the 20th century, Sears wasn't just a store. It was an institution. It sold the first Kenmore washing machine, the first Craftsman toolbox, the first Allstate insurance policy. At its peak, Sears was the largest retailer in America, bigger relative to its era than Amazon is today. Generations of families bought their homes, their appliances, their tools, and even their houses through the Sears catalog. It was the retailer that built the American middle class. By the early 2000s, that empire was struggling. Sears was losing ground to Walmart and Target. Kmart had already filed for bankruptcy once. And that's when a hedge fund manager named Eddie Lampert stepped in. Lampert wasn't a retail executive. He was a Wall Street investor who'd quietly built a fortune buying distressed debt. Through his hedge fund, ESL Investments, he'd accumulated a controlling stake in Kmart's bonds during its bankruptcy. And when Kmart emerged from Chapter 11 in 2003, Lampert controlled it. 2 years later, in 2005, he engineered a merger between Kmart and Sears, creating Sears Holdings, and named himself chairman. The financial press loved it. Lampert was compared to Warren Buffett. Businessweek put him on its cover. He talked about running Sears like a portfolio of assets rather than a retail chain, applying hedge fund thinking to Main Street stores. Investors believed they were watching a genius reinvent an American icon. But running it like a portfolio meant something very different than employees, or investors, understood at the time. Instead of reinvesting in stores, Lampert starved them. Store renovations stopped. IT systems went years without upgrades. Inventory management became so poor that popular items would sit out of stock for months while warehouses overflowed with product nobody wanted. Customers stopped visiting stores that looked and felt abandoned, and sales kept falling, which Lampert then used as justification to cut spending even further. It was a downward spiral, and by design or not, it worked in his favor. Here's the part that turned this from mismanagement into something much more calculated. Sears owned enormous amounts of real estate, flagship stores in premium malls across the country, land that had appreciated for decades. In 2015, Lampert orchestrated a deal where Sears spun off 235 of its most valuable properties into a new publicly traded company called Seritage Growth Properties. Lampert personally owned a large stake in Seritage, and once the deal closed, Sears, the company that used to own these buildings outright, now had to pay rent to Seritage to keep operating out of them. Every dollar of rent Sears paid went to a company Lampert had a direct financial interest in. Sears was, in effect, paying its own chairman to use buildings it used to own for free. Analysts have estimated the rent payments alone drained hundreds of millions of dollars a year out of an already struggling retailer. And Seritage wasn't the only vehicle extracting value. Lampert's hedge fund, ESL Investments, began lending money directly to Sears at high interest rates, sometimes north of 10%. As Sears's credit rating collapsed and traditional lenders grew unwilling to extend financing, ESL stepped in as a lender of last resort. That meant every dollar Sears paid in interest on those loans also flowed back to Lampert. He also sold off pieces of the company. Craftsman Tools, a brand practically synonymous with American manufacturing, was sold to Stanley Black & Decker for around $900 million. Sears' stake in Land's End was spun off separately. Each sale generated cash, and each transaction chipped away at what Sears actually had left to sell to customers. Meanwhile, on the ground, employees were watching all of this unfold in slow motion, without any of the financial engineering being explained to them. Store managers described escalators that stayed broken for years because corporate wouldn't approve repair budgets. Employees were told new registers and better technology were coming soon, a promise repeated for the better part of a decade. Store associates spoke to reporters about working in half-lit sections of stores, understaffed and understocked, while corporate leadership insisted publicly that a turnaround was underway. Many employees stayed loyal to Sears far longer than made financial sense for them personally. Some had worked there for 20, 30 years. They believed in the brand. They believed leadership was working toward a real recovery. What they didn't know was that the mechanisms designed to save the company were simultaneously being used to extract value out of it before it collapsed. By 2018, there was nothing left to strip. On October 15, 2018, Sears Holdings filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. At the time of filing, the company still operated Ocala 700 stores and employed roughly 68,000 people directly, but the broader collapse, when you count every closure and layoff across the Lampert era, eliminated well over 175,000 jobs industry-wide, as Sears and Kmart locations shuttered one after another across the country. Pension obligations for tens of thousands of retirees were left underfunded, a burden that ultimately fell partly on the Federal Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation to absorb. And here's the part that made headlines. Lampert didn't walk away from the bankruptcy. He used his hedge fund, ESL Investments, to make a bid to acquire what remained of Sears out of bankruptcy court, buying roughly 425 remaining stores and the Sears and Kmart brand names for about $5.2 billion, much of which was Sears' own debt that ESL already held. He didn't lose money on Sears' collapse. In many respects, he profited from every stage of it: the rent, the loans, the asset sales, and finally the acquisition of the corpse of the company at a steep discount. Critics, including several former Sears executives and financial analysts, have called this one of the most brazen wealth extraction playbooks in modern retail history. Some bankruptcy creditors even filed lawsuits alleging Lampert and Sears' board improperly enriched Lampert at the expense of the company. Lawsuits that were eventually settled, with Lampert and ESL agreeing to pay over $40 million without admitting wrongdoing. Lampert has defended his record publicly, arguing that he invested billions of his own money trying to keep Sears alive, and that the retail industry's broader decline, not his management, is what ultimately killed the company. It's true that many legacy retailers struggled during this same period, but few, if any, saw their own chairman personally profit from the mechanisms of their decline the way Sears did under Lampert. This wasn't fraud in the traditional sense. There were no fabricated numbers, no SEC criminal charges, no dramatic perp walk. That's what makes it more unsettling, not less. It was a legal playbook for stripping a legacy company for parts, while the people who built it, and the employees who kept showing up every day, absorbed nearly all of the loss. Next case, the $1.2 billion accounting fraud that took down one of Japan's most trusted companies, Toshiba. Subscribe so you don't miss it.